A rich rancher followed his maid after work and was shocked by the discovery. Setting, dusk, fading orange light over a quiet ranch in Texas. The sun was folding itself into the hills, leaving behind a smear of peach and rust across the western sky. The wind had softened, brushing over the pastures with a gentleness that only came after a long, punishing day. Cattle stood still, heads lowered, as if listening to something only the dying light could tell. Nathaniel Gray stood by the back fence, his boots sunk deep in the cold dirt, arms resting on the wooden post he had leaned against since he was a boy. Now, in his late 40s, the man wore his silence like he wore his hat, a fixture, unshaken by time. Wealth clung to him quietly in the cut of his coat, the polish of his truck, but his eyes never betrayed privilege. They carried the kind of stillness that came only from loss or memory. Most evenings ended like this: solitude, soft dusk, the horses fed, and the barn doors locked. But tonight, his gaze drifted, not toward the hills, but toward a figure walking across the field, small, steady, almost invisible in her quietness. Her name was Clara May, barely 25, hired just 6 months ago to help with the cooking and laundry. She spoke little, moved with the kind of grace that was more survival than training, and always left by foot, declining the offer to be driven home. Every evening, she'd wait till the last bell of sun dipped, then slip away like a shadow, returning to its night. But tonight, something in Nathaniel stirred. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt, or just the ache of watching someone walk too long alone. He didn't think, just followed. He moved without sound, keeping his distance. She didn't look back once, just kept walking, past the split-rail fence down the worn trail that curved through the sycamores. Her figure dipped and reappeared through the trees, lit only by flickers of sky between branches. Then she stopped. Nathaniel slowed his steps, hidden behind a tree, breath caught not in fear, but in reverence. What he saw was not what he expected, not a secret lover, nor a hidden shack. Clara stood at a makeshift cross staked into the earth, wrapped in cloth and dried flowers. She knelt, placed her hand over the name etched in the wood, and whispered something only the wind was allowed to hear. He did not move. The hush of the forest held them both in suspension, one in grief, the other in revelation. A soft wind passed between them like a silent witness, and in that holy silence, something shifted, not between them, but within him. Nathaniel didn't speak of what he'd seen. The next morning, Clara showed up as always, coat buttoned high, hair in a loose braid, eyes lowered. She moved through the kitchen like breath through leaves, quiet, unnoticed. But Nathaniel saw her differently now, or rather, he saw her more completely. At breakfast, he left a wool blanket folded neatly on the bench near the back porch, not with her name, not with a note, just there, waiting in the cold where she always tied her shoes before starting work. She said nothing when she saw it, but the next day, she wore it. And for the first time, he noticed a pause in her movements, like she wasn't sure how to carry gratitude. Later that week, he told Martha, the ranch cook, that he'd be taking supper outside. A second plate came with it. He didn't say for whom. He simply set 2 chairs near the barn and waited. Clara came to collect laundry from the clothesline and paused when she saw the setup. Her hands tightened around the basket, but she said nothing. Nathaniel nodded toward the food, then turned back to his plate. She sat without being asked. They didn't speak, not really. Just ate. But she looked at him once, directly for the first time, and her eyes, a soft maple brown, held a guarded question. He didn't answer it. He just passed her the cornbread and nodded. The next evening she left the kitchen a little slower. The one after that she lingered by the back porch, folding the blanket before heading out. Then one morning, she dropped a dish. When Nathaniel stepped closer, he saw it, the faint yellow bloom of an old bruise just beneath the cuff of her sleeve. She pulled her arm back too quickly, the plate still in pieces between them. He didn't reach for her, just stooped, gathered the shards and set them aside. That evening she found a new pair of work gloves left neatly on the porch railing. No price tag, no explanation. When snow came early that month, the trails grew icy. Nathaniel waited until dusk and said casually, "Got a spare room above the stable if you ever get caught in the cold." Clara didn't reply, but the next week, on the night the snow turned bitter and thick, he saw a small light flicker in the stable window. She'd taken the offer. No one on the ranch knew she was sleeping there. He never told a soul. He moved a small heater into the room one afternoon and left a note. Beside it, "The wind doesn't care who's rich. Warm up." She never said thank you. But the way she started placing an extra biscuit on his tray at breakfast, and the way her eyes rested a moment longer on his when passing the coffee, told him everything. It wasn't romance. Not yet. It wasn't charity either. It was something quieter. A shared silence that grew heavier and warmer each day, like coals under ash, not ready to flame, but unwilling to die. The days grew shorter. Mornings came like ghosts, pale and slow to speak. Nathaniel began walking past the stable more often than he needed to, just enough to see the soft flicker of light behind the attic window. Sometimes he left fresh bread at the door. Other times, a newspaper folded to the weather page. Clara said little. She moved through the ranch like she always had, silent, focused, careful. But something about her steps had softened. Not relaxed, but less haunted. One evening, as frost gathered on the barn doors, she lingered near the corral, watching a horse breathe into the cold. Nathaniel stood beside her, his arms crossed, saying nothing. After a long pause, she said, "His name was Isaiah." He didn't ask who. "He was just a boy, my brother, 8 years old when he passed." Her voice was thin, not fragile like something being read aloud after years in a drawer. "That cross in the woods, that's his." Nathaniel's breath froze in the air. "He used to wait for me by the stream every evening," she continued. "Even when Mama said not to, he'd sneak out, just to walk me home from the neighbors. That night, it rained, and I was late." She blinked slowly, not to cry, but to hold it in. "They found him the next day. The river took him, or maybe the man who ran the mill. No one looked too hard. Poor children disappear all the time." Nathaniel swallowed hard. A small breath escaped, but he didn't speak. He didn't know how to. Clara turned to him then. "That's why I walk. Every evening. I retrace the trail he would have taken. I know it's foolish, but some nights I feel like I can hear his feet beside mine." Nathaniel looked down at his hands, rough from decades of work, suddenly feeling too clean. Clara's lips pressed into a line. Mama lost herself after that. Stopped talking. Stopped cooking. One day she just left. Left me with a stepfather who drank more than he worked. I ran the day he told me I reminded him too much of her. Got on a train, then another. This ranch was the first place that didn't ask too many questions. Nathaniel turned his eyes toward the darkening fields. "You remind me of my sister," he said quietly. "She used to sit out by the fence and talk to shadows. Said God lived in the wind." Clara almost smiled. But peace doesn't come easy in broken stories. A week later, a truck pulled into the outer drive. Rusted, loud, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong on clean ranch gravel. A man stepped out. Tall, wide, with a cigarette that hung too low in his mouth. His eyes scanned the land like he owned it. Nathaniel stood at the barn gate, heart still, fingers tight. The man asked, "You got a Clara working here?" Nathaniel didn't answer, just studied him, the way one studies a snake before deciding whether to run or stand still. "She owes me some time," the man added, "and maybe some money." Nathaniel stared for a long beat, then finally said, "Ain't no Clara here." The man scoffed, spit on the gravel, and drove off, tires biting the ground like teeth. That night, Clara found a new lock on the stable door. A key rested on her pillow. No questions, no explanations, just protection, quiet and resolute, and the truth between them, no longer hidden, but not spoken of again. By the time January arrived, the snow was no longer something that came and went. It stayed, like a quiet guest refusing to leave. It thickened on rooftops, blurred fence posts, and painted the horses' backs in a soft, persistent hush. And with it came watching eyes. First, it was Martha, the cook, who noticed the second plate by the barn missing more frequently, or how Clara started showing up with clean hair and warmer shoes. Then it was Earl, the ranch hand, who muttered to no one in particular, "Funny how the stable loft's light burns all night these days." No one asked questions, not directly, but in small towns and tight ranches, silence could press heavier than a sermon, and Nathaniel felt it, not as judgment, but as a murmur from the world itself, asking a question he wasn't ready to answer. He walked slower through the house, spoke less at supper, kept his eyes off the ranch hands when Clara entered the room to clean. One afternoon, while feeding the horses, he noticed something strange. The old gelding, Samson, would follow Clara with his eyes, ears twitching like a hound hearing music. The dog, Bear, once aloof with strangers, now rested at her feet without command. Even the wind, it seemed, had grown stiller around her. One Sunday, Pastor Whitmore stopped by for coffee and conversation, an old friend of Nathaniel's father. His gaze lingered on the wool blanket Clara wore while carrying firewood. "She your help or your guest, son?" he asked, sipping slowly. Nathaniel looked out the window. "She's not a question to be answered," he said simply. The pastor said no more. Later that week, Clara didn't come down for breakfast. Nathaniel found her sitting behind the stable, arms wrapped around herself, face pale. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply knelt beside her and offered the thermos he'd brought. After a long silence, she whispered, "He'll come back." Nathaniel knew who she meant. "Let him," he said. A week passed, then two. The ranch settled into its silence again, but with every boot step, every opened gate, it was clear. The world was waiting. One night, a hawk landed on the fence near the stable, staying longer than birds usually did. Its eyes were sharp, unblinking, as if guarding something unseen. Clara watched it from her window. So did Nathaniel from his porch. The next morning, a note arrived from the sheriff's office, folded and delivered by a passing rider. "Man asking about a Clara May. Says he's family. Seems off. Just a heads up." Nathaniel read it once, burned it in the fireplace, and said nothing to anyone. That evening, as the sky wept cold silver, Clara came to the porch. "If it's trouble for you, I can leave." He didn't respond with words, just moved aside and opened the front door. She didn't enter, not yet, but she looked at him with eyes that had stopped expecting kindness and finally saw it offered without condition. Across the field, the cattle stood still again. A wind picked up, not bitter, but clean, and the ranch, in its old bones and whispered winds, held its breath. Because sometimes the world doesn't shout when something sacred is happening. It simply watches. The storm came without thunder, only a long grey sigh across the land. Snow fell in slow drifts, steady and cold, as if the sky had finally given up pretending it could hold anything back. Inside the stable loft, a single lantern glowed. Nathaniel stood at the base of the ladder, holding a small tin of soup and a linen napkin. Clara hadn't come down in 2 days. He didn't knock, just climbed. She was sitting in the corner, wrapped in the wool blanket he'd given her months ago, knees pulled to her chest. Her hair was unbraided, a small thing that struck him like a whisper of grief. "I brought food," he said, voice low. She didn't respond, only stared at the floorboards like they held a secret no one else could bear. "I'm not sick," she murmured finally. "Not in the way people ask." Nathaniel set the tin down, sat near her, not too close. "I lied to you," she said, words falling like broken glass. "He wasn't my stepfather." A pause. The wind outside scratched at the wooden walls. "He was the man who took me in after Mama left," she continued. "He said I owed him for the roof, for the bread. Every night he reminded me." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a breath, not from shock, but from sorrow too deep for words. "I cleaned for him, cooked, and when I turned 17, I ran." She looked at Nathaniel now, truly looked, her face stripped of every guard she had ever worn. "I didn't want you to think I was ruined," she whispered, "that I brought shame into your house." Nathaniel didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. An old horseshoe, rusted but whole, polished smooth at the center from years of handling. He set it beside her. "My sister used to carry this everywhere," he said. "Said it was luck. Said broken people made the best things stronger." He met her gaze. "I don't think you're ruined," he said gently. "I think you're standing when most would have stayed down." Clara's lip trembled. A tear escaped, but she wiped it away quickly, not out of shame, but habit. He stood to leave, but before descending, he paused. "You're safe here," he said. "Not because you hide, but because you belong." And with that, he stepped down the ladder. Clara stared at the horseshoe in her lap. Old, imperfect, but still shaped like a cradle. That night, she didn't sleep curled into herself. She laid on her back, eyes open, hand resting gently over the piece of metal that now held more grace than gold. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to rest, not out of exhaustion, but because someone had finally called her worthy. By March, the snow had begun to lift. The earth, still damp and bruised, exhaled steam in the early hours, like it was remembering how to breathe again. Clara had moved into the ranch house by then, not as a servant, but as something else. Nathaniel had never named it, neither had she, but the space between them no longer felt filled with questions. It felt lived in, trusted. She tended to the garden beds, repaired a torn saddle without being asked, painted the porch railings in the evenings when the sky turned apricot. And Nathaniel found himself talking more not with his mouth, but in the small ways men like him did, setting her cup out before she came down, leaving a book on the stairs, fixing the creaky hinge on her door before she noticed. The silence between them had become a place of rest. Then one morning, as the sky stretched pale and clean, a truck pulled onto the road again, the same rust-bitten one Nathaniel had seen months ago. This time it stopped closer, bold, deliberate. Clara saw it first. She was feeding the hens when the engine cut. Her hands froze, not from fear, but memory. The man stepped out, same lean frame, same crooked sneer. His boots scraped the gravel like knives. His voice was casual, cold. "Clara," he drawled, "you've had your little vacation. Time to come back and finish what you ran from." Nathaniel stood by the barn door, arms folded, not as a threat, but as a witness. Clara didn't move. The man scoffed. "You think this place changes what you are? You're still mine." She straightened then, wiped her hands on her apron, walked forward until there was only a few feet between them. "No," she said, voice low but steady. "I was never yours." The man smirked. "You forget the debt? The kindness I gave you when no one else would?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "You fed me shame, taught me fear. You called it kindness because you didn't hit me with fists. Just silence." The man's face twitched. "Leave," she said, "or I will tell them everything, every name, every bruise." He looked at Nathaniel then, but the rancher hadn't moved. His stillness spoke louder than a raised rifle. Around them, the ranch hands had begun to gather, not with pitchforks, just presence, watching, silent. The dog growled low, the horses stirred, and for the first time, the man seemed small. He spat. "She's yours now, huh?" Nathaniel replied softly. "No, she's finally hers." The man backed away, got in his truck, and drove off without another word. When the dust settled, no one clapped, no one spoke, but something sacred had shifted, not just between Clara and Nathaniel, but in the air, the ground, the people. Earl tipped his hat when he passed her later. Martha brought an extra slice of pie. The stable boy stopped calling her the help and started calling her Miss May. No ceremony, no parade, just small changes in the way a town breathes around someone who's no longer hiding. Spring came slowly that year, not with wildflowers or fanfare, but with green shoots pushing through cracked earth, patient and sure. The kind of spring that doesn't need to be seen to be believed. Clara stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she'd stopped running. She never moved into Nathaniel's room, never wore a ring, and never asked for promises. What they shared grew from silence, not declarations. She had her own room at the end of the hall and kept the window open at night so the wind could still find her. She began teaching Martha's niece how to mend quilts, built a small herb garden near the old well. Some Sundays, she read stories to the stable boy when he lingered too long with chores. She didn't ask for these things. They just grew around her. Nathaniel never tried to name it. He just made sure the path to her brother's cross in the woods was cleared every week, even when it rained. One morning, a box appeared outside the church. Inside was a blanket, hand-stitched, cream-colored, with a horseshoe sewn into the corner and the initials CM along the edge. No note, no explanation. The pastor placed it over the shoulders of a shivering widow who had come with no coat. It stayed there, and though no one ever said it out loud, the town changed after that, just enough to feel different. The stares softened, the whispers faded. Folks nodded more, asked less. Even Earl, who once muttered about the stable light, was heard telling the new ranch hand, "Miss May's the kind you listen to. even when she's quiet. Nathaniel aged in silence, as men like him often do. But his porch always had 2 chairs now, one for the sky, one for her. On Clara's birthday, he gave her a carving, a simple piece of driftwood shaped into a hawk, wings curled but not in flight. Beneath it, one word: endure. Years passed, but the stories didn't. They stayed unspoken, alive only in the ways people changed around them. And when strangers came through the valley, asking about the woman who lived on the Gray Ranch, no one gave her history. They just said, she stayed, and that was enough. The land remembered not the storm nor the sorrow, only the quiet courage of a woman who chose to stay and made the world softer by doing so.